The fog had not lifted by the time she reached the gate. It hung over the village of Erith like a held breath, thick, pale, carrying the particular stillness that settles over places where too many people have stopped moving. The quarantine banners were strung across the road in the kingdom's official red and black, snapping once in a cold morning wind before going limp again. Beyond them, the village was silent. Not the silence of sleep, the silence of surrender. She walked toward the gate without slowing. She wore no armor, no mask of treated cloth soaked in protective herbs, the kind the royal healers had been distributing before they retreated north. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, her satchel worn across one side, her hands completely empty and swinging free at her sides. She looked like someone returning home from a market that had closed early. She looked, to the royal courier who stepped directly into her path with one arm raised, like a woman who had made a decision a long time ago and was simply now arriving at it. "You cannot pass," he said, his voice muffled through layers of protective wrapping. "Royal decree. The southern quarantine zones are sealed by order of." She stepped around him without breaking stride. On the ridge above the fog line, a single figure in full armor raised a looking glass to his eye. He had been still for a long time. Something in his chest that he had spent 3 years convincing himself was simply an old wound pulled tight with a sudden and bewildering ache. He had recognized the way she walked before he had recognized her face. She did not hesitate at the threshold of the quarantine gate. She did not pause, did not look back, did not make any gesture toward the watching courier or the watching ridge or the watching kingdom that had cast her out. She walked through the red and black banners, and the fog swallowed her whole. On the ridge, the Alpha King lowered his looking glass very slowly. His jaw was a hard line beneath his helmet. 3 years. A quill scratching parchment. A door closing. He raised the looking glass again. The fog gave him nothing. "Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches." 3 days before she walked through that gate, Lyra Ashveil was crouched in the gray light of early morning, grinding dried fennel root against a flat stone with the focused patience of someone who had learned to find meaning in small, repetitive things. Her dwelling was not much. A single room built into the lee of a chalk hillside at the southern border's outermost edge, where the kingdom's maps became vague and the kingdom's interest became non-existent. The walls were dry-stacked stone, chinked with river clay. The roof was timber and heavy thatch that she had repaired twice herself with materials bartered from the nearest border village. There was a hearth, a workbench, a sleeping pallet, and 3 walls of rough shelving that held more knowledge than most palace libraries, bundles of dried herbs sorted by property and season, clay jars of tincture and compress. Notebooks filled margin to margin with her own careful handwriting, and at the far end of the highest shelf, a row of journals that were not about medicine at all but about patterns, animal behavior, soil changes, the particular way certain birds altered their migration routes when something invisible and terrible was moving through the land below them. She had been watching the birds for 2 months. The fennel root became powder beneath her hands. She tipped it into a small jar, sealed it, labeled it in her precise script, and set it on the workbench beside 7 others she had prepared since dawn. Outside, the wind was coming from the south. She could smell it, that particular edge to the air that the southern villagers called plague breath. The faint metallic sweetness that sat beneath ordinary cold. Most people could not detect it. She had been able to since childhood. The way some people can hear a tone just outside ordinary range. It was not a gift she had chosen. It was simply something she was. She picked up her observation journal and opened it to the page she had been updating each morning for the past 11 days. The notes were meticulous. 17 sparrows found dead in the gully east of the second ridge, not from predation. The bodies intact, eyes clouded in the specific way she had catalogued from previous outbreak sites. 3 foxes behaving with the disoriented circling that indicated early neurological involvement. The deer had moved north 4 days ago, the whole herd gone overnight, leaving trails in the frost that pointed away from the southern forest with an urgency that was almost communicative. The plague was not moving at the rate the capital's dispatches claimed. It was moving 3 times faster. She closed the journal, set it down, looked at the south-facing window of her small dwelling for a long moment. The gray light coming through it, the smell on the wind. The silence of the hillside that felt less like peace, and more like the quiet before an enormous sound. She thought about Aerith, the village where she had been born, 26 years ago. In a room above a healer's workshop that no longer stood. The market square with the old stone well. The family she had known as a child, the Marate family, the Solon Weavers. The dozen households whose names she still carried in her memory like pressed flowers, fragile and exact. She thought about the capital's last official dispatch, which had arrived 4 days ago via border courier, and which she had read 3 times with increasing coldness. The Royal Medical Corps had determined that the southern quarantine zones were beyond effective intervention. Resources would be redirected to the protection of northern population centers. The southern villages were to be considered, in the language of administrative necessity, a contained sacrifice. Contained sacrifice. She set the journal down on the workbench, stood, rolled her shoulders once, the way she always did when she was finished deliberating and had arrived somewhere irrevocable. There was a knock at her door. She opened it to find old Marate, the elder from the nearest border village, standing in the morning cold with his hat in his hands and his eyes full of something that sat between hope and guilt. "You've seen the birds," he said. It was not a question. "I've seen them," she said. "Aerith has stopped sending runners. 3 days now, no word." He turned his hat in his hands. "The royal healers passed through heading north yesterday morning. All of them. Carts full." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back inside, picked up her satchel from its hook, and began to pack with the calm efficiency of someone following a plan they had made a long time ago and had simply been waiting to execute. "Lyra," Marate said quietly from the doorway. "The exile order. If the Crown's forces see you in an active quarantine zone without authorization." "They will see me working," she said, without looking up from her packing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The dispatches say the king himself is riding south to observe the containment line." Her hands did not slow, but something shifted in her face, a tightening around the eyes, brief and controlled. "Then he will observe it," she said, "from a distance." She snapped the satchel clasp shut, reached up to the highest shelf and took down a single journal, old, its cover worn to softness, her mother's handwriting on the spine. She placed it carefully inside the satchel, against her side where it would be protected. Outside, the wind turned, and the smell of it was unmistakable now. She could feel the plague like a distant pressure at the edges of her awareness. The way you feel a storm before the sky shows any sign of it. She was ready. She had been ready for 3 years. She found the fox before she had walked an hour from her dwelling. It was lying in the underbrush at the edge of the old deer trail that cut southeast toward Aerith, half hidden beneath the root shelf of a fallen oak. She almost missed it, would have, if not for the way the surrounding birds had gone silent in a radius around that particular spot, the way they always went quiet near something the plague had touched. She stopped walking, crouched, parted the underbrush with one careful hand. The fox was young, a female, her coat still carrying the particular brightness of an animal that had been healthy until very recently. She was alive. Lyra could see the shallow movement of her ribs, but her eyes were clouded in the way Lyra had catalogued too many times. And her legs moved in small, involuntary tremors against the dead leaves. The disoriented cycling motion of early neurological involvement. She had perhaps a few hours, maybe less. Lyra set her satchel down beside the path. She did not reach for anything inside it. She did not pull out a tincture or a compress or any of the 7 carefully prepared jars she had packed that morning. She simply settled herself onto the cold ground beside the fox, crossed her legs, set her hands palm up on her knees, and went very still. This was the part that looked like nothing. This was the part that had always been impossible to explain. She closed her eyes. There was a quality of attention that Lyra had developed since childhood that was not quite meditation, and not quite listening, and not quite sensing. It was all 3 at once. Collapsed into something that had no name in the kingdom's medical vocabulary. Her mother had called it going to the quiet place. The old southern texts, the ones crumbling in the archives that nobody read anymore, called it something older, the plague tongue frequency, the particular inner register of an omega born with the rare capacity to perceive illness as a presence rather than a process. She went there now. The world outside did not disappear exactly. She was still aware of the cold ground beneath her, the smell of dead leaves, the distant call of a single bird resuming somewhere above the silence radius. But those things became peripheral. The way the sounds of a crowded room become peripheral when someone you love says your name. What moved to the center of her awareness was something else entirely. She felt the plague. It was not a dramatic sensation. It never was from the inside. People who heard about her gift always imagined it as something violent, a battle, a confrontation, a war of wills between a woman and a force of nature. It was nothing like that. What she felt, when she went to the quiet place and extended her awareness toward the illness in the fox's small body, was more like finding a presence in a darkened room. Something large and directionless and frightened in the way that things without language are frightened, not with thoughts or intentions but with sheer undirected pressure. The need to be somewhere, to be doing the only thing it knew how to do, which was expand into available warmth and continue. She did not fight it. She breathed out slowly and she reached toward it the way you reach toward a nervous animal, not grabbing, not demanding, simply making herself available. Present, patient, offering a direction without forcing one. The humming began so softly that she was often unaware of it herself. It was not a sound she produced deliberately. It rose from somewhere below her sternum, a tone that sat at the very lowest edge of audibility. More vibration than sound, and it carried something she had no adequate word for, an invitation perhaps, a suggestion, a very gentle pointing. Here, the hum said, in the language beneath language. Here is somewhere better. Here is somewhere that will hold you without suffering. Come this way. The plague presence in the fox shifted. She felt it the way you feel a tide change, not immediately, not dramatically, but undeniably. The pressure that had been pressing outward against the walls of the animal's small body began, slowly, to reorient, to listen, to consider. She maintained the hum, maintained the stillness, maintained the quality of patient invitation that was the only thing that worked, that had always been the only thing that worked. And she guided the presence with the gentleness of someone leading a frightened child out of a dark room. She pointed it toward the flat stone beside the root shelf of the fallen oak. The stone was dead matter, no warmth, no living system for the plague to expand into. Just cold mineral silence where it could dissipate and still. The presence followed. She felt it leave the fox like a slow exhalation, felt it move across the small distance between living flesh and cold stone, felt it settle into the mineral stillness and begin to quiet, to lose its direction, to become simply inert. Gone, not destroyed. She had never been able to destroy it, only redirect it, but harmless. Finished, released into a form of matter that would not carry it further. The fox's legs stopped trembling. Lyra opened her eyes. The animal lay still for a moment. Then her ears moved, rotating toward a sound somewhere in the distance. Then she lifted her head slowly, with the tentative care of someone waking from a long and unpleasant sleep. She looked at Lyra with eyes that were clearing, the clouded film receding, the animal's natural amber brightness returning beneath it. They regarded each other for a moment. Then the fox stood, shook herself once from nose to tail, and walked into the underbrush without looking back. Lyra sat where she was for a long moment after the animal disappeared. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, never from fear, but from the particular expenditure that her gift always cost her, the way a muscle trembles after sustained effort. She breathed through it. Let it pass. She became aware, gradually, that she was not alone. Old Marate was standing at the edge of the deer trail, 20 feet away. He had followed her, she realized, worried, perhaps, or simply unwilling to let her walk into the south without a witness. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized. The particular combination of wonder and sorrow that crossed people's faces when they saw her gift and understood, simultaneously, why it had frightened the physicians so much. The old texts call it plague tongue, she said, without turning around. She had known he was there for several minutes. I know what the old texts call it, Marate said quietly. My grandmother spoke of a woman who had it. 3 generations back. She saved an entire river valley. He paused. They burned her house afterward. Lyra picked up her satchel and stood. Times change, she said. Do they? Marate asked. She looked at him. He looked back, his old eyes carrying the honest weight of someone who has watched the world long enough to stop pretending it improves quickly. "The courier from the capital," he said. "He came through Erith this morning, heading back north. I spoke to him on the road." He hesitated. "The royal healers are not just retreating. They have been ordered to retreat. Someone in the Capital Medical Council issued the order 2 weeks ago, before the quarantine lines were even fully established." His voice dropped. "Lyra, someone made this decision very early, before the outbreak was even fully mapped." She went still. "That is not a medical decision," she said slowly. "No," Mairead agreed. "It is not." The wind moved through the dead branches above them, and on it, unmistakably, the faint metallic sweetness of plague breath, closer now than it had been this morning. She tightened the strap of her satchel and turned south. She did not sleep that night. She made camp at the edge of the Erith boundary forest, close enough to smell the village on the wind, but far enough to remain outside the official quarantine perimeter until morning. She built a small fire, not for warmth but for light, and she sat beside it with her mother's journal open across her knees, and read it the way she always read it when she was frightened, not from the beginning, but from the middle, from the pages that had been read so many times the edges had gone soft as cloth. Her mother's name had been Sarah. She had been an Omega healer of modest official standing and extraordinary unofficial capability, practicing in the Southern Territories during a time when the kingdom's medical hierarchy was slightly less rigid than it was now. Slightly, not meaningfully. She had possessed a version of the Plague Tongue gift, less developed than Lyra's, capable of sensing illness as a presence, but not always of redirecting it fully. She had managed smaller outbreaks throughout Lyra's childhood with a quiet competence that the local villages recognized and the capital ignored entirely, because the capital had never looked this far south with any real attention. When Lyra was 8 years old, a waterborne illness had moved through 3 villages along the Solon River. Not the plague, something smaller, faster, and in its own way crueler for the speed with which it took children. Sarah had walked into those villages the same way Lyra had walked into Erith today. Without hesitation, without waiting for authorization that was never coming. She had saved most of them. But the illness along the Solon had been entrenched, multi-site, and the process of negotiation and redirection across 3 simultaneous outbreak locations had cost Sarah something that could not be replenished quickly enough. Lyra had been told, by the village elder who found her afterward, that her mother had simply sat down in the 3rd village square when she was finished, and had not been able to stand back up. Not from the illness, she had never caught it, had never been able to catch it, the same inexplicable immunity that Lyra carried. From the effort, from giving the full weight of her inner frequency to the negotiation for so many hours across so many sites without rest or food or anyone to anchor her back to herself. Lyra Ashveil had died in that village square, quietly, with her hands still pressed to the stone. Lyra had been told this when she was 8. She had not fully understood it until she was older, and she had spent the years since understanding it with increasing and very specific terror, not of the plague, not of illness, not of exile or tribunal, or the king's signature on a piece of parchment. Her fear, the one that lived in the deepest and most honest part of her, was this: that she would give everything she had, as her mother had, and it would not be enough. That she would empty herself completely into the negotiation, and the plague would simply wait her out, and the villages would still fall. And she would have spent her life and her gift and her mother's legacy on a task too large for one person to carry alone. She turned to a later page in the journal. Her mother's handwriting changed in the final entries, still precise, but with a new deliberateness, as though each word was being chosen with the knowledge that there might not be many more. One entry in particular she had memorized years ago, but still needed to read in the original, in her mother's hand, to feel its full weight. The entry said, "The gift is not diminished by sharing it. I have been afraid to teach Lyra, because teaching requires admitting that this work has limits. And I have not wanted her to know about limits yet. But limits are not the same as failure. Limits are simply the shape of one person. 2 people have a different shape. I should have found others sooner. I should have been less afraid of being known." Lyra closed the journal. She sat with the fire and the dark and the smell of the south for a long time. She thought about the tribunal hall, the way the chamber had felt, enormous, formal, built to make individuals feel small against the weight of institutional certainty. The physicians had been very certain. They had documents, protocols, precedents. A vocabulary of professional risk management that had been developed over generations, specifically to sound reasonable while doing unreasonable things. She had stood in front of all of that and had not been able to find the words. Not because she didn't have them, but because she had understood in that hall that the words were not the problem. The problem was that the people who needed to hear them had already decided not to. She remembered the king most clearly in his stillness. He had been seated at the head tribunal table, slightly elevated, and he had not looked at her once during the entire proceeding. Not when the charges were read. Not when the physician spoke. Not when she was given her brief opportunity to respond and managed only a few sentences before the head physician interrupted with a procedural objection. Not when the verdict was delivered. She had watched him the whole time, the way you watch someone you are waiting to look back at you, and he had never looked back. His hand had moved across the parchment with the same detached efficiency he probably used to sign supply requisitions. She had walked out of the tribunal hall into a gray afternoon and had not stopped walking, essentially, for 3 years. The fire burned low. She fed it one more piece of wood, watched the flame recover, and then lay down on her bedroll and looked at the sky through the bare branches above her. The stars were very bright and very cold. She thought about what Marit had said. Someone made this decision very early, before the outbreak was even fully mapped. She thought about the plague presence she had felt in the fox, wild, directionless, hungry. A natural outbreak felt like weather, unintentional, simply what illness did when it found a pathway. She had felt natural outbreaks before. She was very familiar with what they felt like. The presence she had felt in the fox had not felt entirely like weather. She filed that thought carefully in the part of her mind that held things she was not yet ready to speak aloud, closed her eyes, and made herself sleep for the hours she had left before dawn. She would need everything she had tomorrow. She would need to not be afraid. She breathed slowly, the way her mother had taught her. The same slow rhythm that preceded the quiet place. And somewhere between one breath and the next she found the edge of sleep and let it take her. Above her, the stars moved their slow arc across the winter sky. And from the south, carried on a wind that no protective cloth could filter, the plague breath came, patient and enormous and waiting. Dawn came without color. The sky over Aerith was the particular white of days that do not intend to brighten. A flat and featureless light that turned the quarantine banners gray and made the village beyond them look like something drawn in ash. Lyra stood at the gate for exactly one breath, not from hesitation, but from the discipline of arriving fully in her body before she asked it to do something difficult. She felt the boundary of the plague's presence from here, even 30 feet from the gate. It was enormous, far larger than the fox, far larger than anything she had negotiated with alone before. She went in anyway. The village of Aerith had once held 400 people. She had grown up knowing its sounds, the morning calls between households, the particular rhythm of the market on 6th day. The bell above the old cooperative hall that rang the hour in a tone slightly flat from decades of use. Now it held only silence and the sound of her own boots on the frost-hardened road. Every door was shut, every window covered. Here and there a thin thread of smoke from a chimney told her that people were still inside, still alive, still maintaining the small fire of survival. But no one came out. No one called to her. The village watched her from behind its shuttered eyes and said nothing. She found the village square by memory. The old stone well stood at its center, exactly where it had always stood, its wooden cover warped now and dark with damp. She set her satchel down beside it, removed her cloak and folded it across the satchel. Stood in the cold in her working clothes, heavy linen, practical, unremarkable, and looked at the square around her. The plague presence here was immense, pressing against the edges of her awareness like a physical weight, like standing at the base of a very large and very dark wave. She knelt beside the well, pressed both palms flat against the stone of the well's base, closed her eyes, went to the quiet place. She had known it would be different at this scale. She had prepared herself, or had tried to. The preparation had not fully accounted for the reality of it. The plague presence across an entire village was not simply a larger version of what she had felt in the fox. It was qualitatively different. The way a river is qualitatively different from a cup of water despite being made of the same thing. It had density. It had what she could only describe as gravity. a pulling quality that pressed against her inner frequency the moment she extended her awareness toward it. It pushed back, hard. She breathed, maintained the stillness. Let the pushing happen without bracing against it. The way you let a current move around you when you know that fighting it will only exhaust you faster. She began to hum. The tone rose from its usual place, low and steady. The vibration moving through her sternum and into her palms, and from her palms into the cold stone beneath her hands. She felt the plague presence register it, felt the vast dark thing shift its attention toward the sound, the way something enormous and slow shifts to track a new input. Good. She needed its attention. Without its attention, she could not lead it anywhere. She offered the trade. Not in words. In direction. In the warm, patient pointing of her inner frequency toward the earth beneath the square. Specifically toward the bedrock she could sense 2 feet below the frost line, cold and mineral and permanent. A place where the plague's hungry pressure could dissipate into geological stillness. She had done this before, smaller, always smaller. Now she held the invitation open for a very long time, maintaining it through the effort of keeping her inner frequency steady, while the plague's counterpressure pushed against her like weather. The first shift came after 2 hours. She felt it, the vast presence beginning to reorient, the leading edge of it turning, slowly and reluctantly, in the direction she was pointing. Not surrendering, considering. She held everything she had very steady and kept pointing. Kept the hum constant, and the invitation open, and the patience absolute. Because this was the moment where everything could reverse if she pushed instead of led. She did not push. She waited and led and waited. Over the next 3 hours, the plague presence moved. Not quickly, not all at once. In the way of something massive and reluctant, it shifted its direction by degrees. The pressure against her frequency easing as more and more of its attention followed the direction she offered. She guided it down, through her palms, through the stone, through the frost into the bedrock below, where it settled into mineral silence and began its long, slow dispersal into inertness. Her arms were shaking by the time she felt the last of it go. She became aware, gradually, that she had been on her knees for 5 hours. The cold had moved through her knees and into her hips, and she could not immediately feel her hands, which were still pressed flat against the stone of the well's base. She breathed through the returning awareness of her body with the careful patience of someone taking stock of damage after a long ordeal. Then she heard a door open. She turned her head. An old man stood in a doorway across the square, leaning on the frame with the tentative posture of someone who has been told repeatedly that the air outside will kill them and is testing this claim carefully. He looked at her. Then he looked at the square around him, at the air, at his own hands. His eyes were clear, not the clouded, unfocused gaze of plague involvement. Clear and dark and filling slowly with something enormous. He took 1 step out of the doorway. Then another. He stood in the square in the cold morning air and breathed, just breathed, and his eyes never left her face. On the perimeter wall, the royal scout who had been watching through the observation slit for 5 hours pressed his back against the cold stone and slid very slowly to the ground. His hands were shaking as he reached for his message case. He wrote 4 words. Sent the bird north. On the ridge above Aerith, the king was already saddling his horse before the message arrived. The second village was called Solon Crossing. It sat 3 miles east of Aerith along a road that had once been busy with trade carts and was now empty in the particular way of roads that have forgotten their purpose. Lyra arrived there the morning after Aerith, walking steadily despite the fact that she had slept only 4 hours on the cleared floor of the cooperative hall with her cloak over her and her satchel under her head. She had eaten half a portion of hard bread and drunk 2 cups of water from the supplies the old man. His name was Dort, she had learned. A former cooperative manager who had outlasted everyone else in his household, had pressed into her hands with trembling urgency before she left. She accepted the food because she had learned, slowly and against her natural tendency toward self-sufficiency, that refusing gifts from people who needed to give them was its own kind of unkindness. Solon Crossing took 6 hours. The plague there was less entrenched, newer, she thought, sensing its quality during the negotiation, as though it had arrived more recently and had not yet fully settled its direction into the living systems of the village. The negotiation was difficult, but not the prolonged ordeal of Aerith. When she walked out through the Solon Crossing gate in the late afternoon, she was tired but functional, her hands steady, her inner frequency still intact. The third village, 2 days later, was harder. Marate had caught up with her between Solon Crossing and the third village, arriving on horseback with a pack mule loaded with supplies, proper supplies, not just bread, but dried meat and warming herbs and a small tent and an extra blanket, assembled with the methodical care of someone who had decided that if this woman was going to walk into plague zones without support, she would at least do it adequately fed. He did not ask her permission. He simply fell into step beside her, or rather slightly behind her, at a respectful distance that acknowledged both his desire to help and his understanding that she was not asking for company. She did not tell him to go back. That was how Sable found them, or rather, how Sable announced herself. Stepping out from behind a grain store on the edge of the third village's perimeter with the self-possessed directness of a child who has made a decision and is not interested in negotiating it. She was perhaps 11 years old, dark-eyed and serious, wearing 3 layers of clothing against the cold and carrying a small pack that suggested she had been preparing for this for longer than the conversation it would take to approve it. "I know where the water sources are in the next 4 villages," Sable said, to Lyra specifically, without preamble. "And I know which families in each one had contact with the border traders 3 months ago, which is when my father thinks this started. I can be useful." Lyra looked at her for a long moment. "Where are your parents?" "My mother is in the third village," Sable said. Her voice did not waver. "She was sick. She is better now." A pause that lasted exactly 1 breath. "Because of you." Lyra studied the girl's face, the steadiness of it, the precise quality of the grief underneath the steadiness, the particular courage of someone who has been frightened and has decided to turn toward the thing that frightened them rather than away from it. She recognized it. She had seen it in her own face once. In the reflection of a still pond on the morning, she decided to walk to Aerith. "Stay behind the perimeter until I come out," Lyra said. "Then you can carry the satchel if you still want to." Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. Sable nodded once and moved to the perimeter wall without further discussion. The third village took 8 hours. When Lyra came out, she came out walking, but only just. Marate was at her side before she had taken 3 steps and steered her to a sitting position against the outer wall with the firm practicality of someone who has decided that pride is a luxury ill people and exhausted healers cannot afford. She did not argue. She sat and drank the warm broth he produced from somewhere, and let the shaking in her hands work its way through and out. Sable took the satchel without comment and organized its contents with a quiet efficiency that suggested she had been observing Lyra's packing system since Aerith and had been planning improvements. They made camp above the third village that night, and it was there, sitting beside the fire with Marate across from her and Sable already asleep wrapped in 2 blankets, that Lyra became aware that she was being watched. Not by the scouts she already knew were positioned on the eastern ridge. She had been aware of them since Solon Crossing, had registered their presence the way she registered weather patterns, as information rather than threat. This was different. 1 figure, high on the ridge, above the scout positions, standing alone where the outline of a person was just barely visible against the lighter dark of the winter sky. Not a scout. Scouts moved, adjusted, communicated. This figure was completely still. She looked at the outline for a long time across the fire and the dark hillside between them. She could feel nothing specific through the distance. The bond was a muted thing at this range, reduced to a low and persistent awareness at the back of her consciousness that she had spent 3 years training herself to ignore. She did not ignore it now. She simply observed it, the way she observed everything, with clarity and without immediate reaction. Then she looked back at the fire and added another piece of wood and said nothing. In the morning, she counted the villages remaining. 7. The figure on the ridge was still there when she looked up at dawn, a dark shape against the lightning sky, unmoving. She picked up her cloak, nodded to Marate, accepted her satchel from a newly awakened and immediately businesslike Sable, and walked toward the fourth village without acknowledging the ridge at all. He told himself he was there for strategic assessment. He had been telling himself this for 2 days, standing on the ridge above the quarantine villages in his full armor with his looking glass and his commanders and his perfectly legitimate reasons. Watching a woman he had exiled walk into pestilence with her bare hands and walk back out with the dead waking behind her. Strategic assessment. Military intelligence. A responsible monarch's obligation to understand all variables in a national health emergency. He was lying to himself, and he knew it, and he kept doing it anyway because the alternative, the honest accounting of why he could not make himself leave the ridge. Why he woke before his commanders each morning and was already standing at the overlook when the sky was still dark. Why something in the center of his chest pulled tighter every time she disappeared through a village gate and did not release until she walked back out. The alternative required him to look directly at something he had been deliberately not looking at for 3 years. He was looking at it now. Her name was Lyra Ashveil, and he had signed the order that ended her career and her place in the kingdom with the same hand he was currently using to hold a looking glass trained on her back. That fact had always been abstractly present in his mind, filed in the category of difficult but necessary decisions. It was becoming, with each passing day on this ridge, considerably less abstract. On the morning of the 5th village, something changed. He was not entirely sure afterward what made him move. His commanders were occupied with the repositioning of the southern observation posts. A logistical discussion that required his nominal attention, but not his actual presence. The village below was called Wren's Mill, and it was larger than the previous 4 combined, a regional hub with a mill, a small market, a healer's post that had been abandoned 3 weeks ago. The plague presence there was, by his scouts' reports, the densest they had recorded. He found himself moving down the ridge before he had made a conscious decision to do so. He left his commanders behind. He left the looking glass. He walked down the hillside in his full armor through the cold morning air toward the quarantine perimeter. And when the guard at the perimeter line moved to intercept him with entirely reasonable concern, he waved them aside with a gesture that had been stopping people in doorways since he was 19 years old. And he walked through the perimeter line into the village. He found her in the square. She was already deep in the negotiation. He recognized it from the ridge observations, the absolute stillness, the particular quality of the air around her that was not quite sound and not quite silence, the way her hands were pressed flat against the stone of the mill's outer foundation wall, her head slightly bowed, her breathing slow and completely controlled. She was on her knees in the cold square, and there was something about the sight of her from 30 feet away, at ground level rather than through a looking glass from a ridge, that was entirely different. More real. More devastating. He took 1 step toward her. The bond activated. He had felt the bond before, distantly muted, at the safe remove of deliberate suppression and significant distance. He had kept both of those in place for 3 years with the focused effort of a man who had decided that certain things were not going to be part of his life, and had applied his considerable will to enforcing that decision. 3 years of distance and suppression, and it had been manageable. An ache. A wrongness he had learned to treat as background noise. At 30 feet, with no distance and no time to prepare his suppression, the bond did not feel like background noise. It felt like everything he had refused to feel for 3 years arriving simultaneously. Recognition, deep cellular, the kind that does not ask permission. The specific and overwhelming sense of her, which was not perfume or appearance but something interior and irreducible. Something that his alpha nature had identified the first time he was ever in the same room with her and had been insisting on ever since. Quietly and persistently, through 3 years of willful deafness. He took another step, and the plague presence brushed against him. It found almost nothing to catch on. His alpha biology provided a degree of natural resistance that was not immunity but was significant protection. The plague registered him and moved on, returning its attention to its negotiation with the far more compelling frequency emanating from the woman on her knees at the foundation wall. But the brief contact, combined with the full force of the bond's activation, combined with 2 days without adequate sleep and 3 days of watching something his mind could not fully categorize or contain, was too much. His knees hit the stone of the square. He was aware of this happening. He was aware, with the detached clarity of a man watching himself from a slight distance, that he was going down, not from illness. His body showed none of the plague's early markers, but from the sheer accumulated weight of the moment, of 3 years, of the specific and irreversible knowledge, arriving now with full force, that the woman kneeling 30 feet from him in a plague village with her bare hands on a stone wall was someone he had wronged in a way that could not be undone by anything as simple as a decision. In the seconds before darkness, she stood up. She turned. She looked at him across the square with an expression he could not read. Not fear, not surprise, not satisfaction, not pity. Something older than all of those. Something that looked, from the failing edge of his consciousness, almost like recognition meeting recognition. Like two people seeing each other clearly for the first time, after a very long time of looking away. She did not move toward him. She watched him fall. And then the cold stone came up to meet him, and the square went dark. And the last thing he was aware of was the bond, not aching now, not muted, but fully present. Fully alive, pulling toward her like a compass finding north after years of deliberate misdirection. The cottage had belonged to the mill keeper. It was a small, practical space, a single room with a stone hearth, a workbench along one wall, 2 chairs, and a window facing east that let in the flat white light of a winter afternoon. Someone had cleared it thoroughly before using it as a recovery space, sweeping the floor and opening the window briefly to change the air. And there was a faint smell of the cleansing herbs Lyra used after each village session, sharp and green against the cold. Caelan woke to the sound of bread being broken. He lay still for a moment before opening his eyes, which was a habit built from years of waking in unfamiliar places and preferring to assess before revealing consciousness. He was on a pallet against the far wall, covered with 2 blankets that were not his own. His armor had been removed, all of it, efficiently, down to the base layer, and stacked against the wall nearby with a neatness that suggested someone who had no reverence for its symbolic weight and had simply treated it as an obstacle to practical care. He opened his eyes. She was sitting in the chair across the room, eating a piece of bread with the focused, unsentimental efficiency of someone refueling between tasks. She had not looked up. She was reading something in her lap, a small notebook, her writing covering the page in the dense, precise script he had seen once before briefly. In a file of evidence presented at a tribunal he did not want to think about right now. She did not look up when he stirred. He sat up slowly. His head was clear, no fever. No disorientation beyond the ordinary kind that follows unconsciousness. The bond was still present in his chest, quieter now. A steady warmth rather than the overwhelming force that had taken his knees in the square. He was careful not to examine it too directly. He was not ready for that yet. "You removed my armor," he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "It was impractical," she said, without looking up from her notebook. "You were in contact with the square stone for several minutes. The cold transfers quickly through metal." She turned a page. "You do not have the plague. Your temperature is normal and your eyes are clear. You were unconscious for approximately 2 hours." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. She made a small sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite dismissal. He swung his legs off the pallet and sat on its edge, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "I came to assess the situation," he said. "The quarantine lines, the progression rate, the council requires." "I know why you came," she said, still without looking up. "The council requires visible evidence of royal oversight during a national emergency. Your presence in the South satisfies that requirement regardless of whether you understand anything you observe." She turned another page. "I am familiar with how that works." The sentence landed with the quiet precision of something she had not needed to sharpen, because it had always been sharp. He was quiet for a moment. "That is not the only reason I came." She looked up then, just briefly, a single direct look, assessing, giving nothing away, before returning to her notebook. "I know that too," she said. The fire in the hearth shifted, settling into a lower burn. Outside, he could hear Marate's voice somewhere distant, and the lighter sound of the girl, Sable. One of his scouts had told him her name, organizing something with the brisk purposefulness of a small person who takes logistics very seriously. He tried again. The work you are doing is not for you or the crown, she said. The words were not harsh. They were simply accurate. I want to be clear about that. I did not come to the South to demonstrate anything or to petition for reinstatement or to make any kind of statement about my situation. I came because the people in these villages needed someone to come, and no one else would. She set the notebook on her knee and looked at him fully this time, holding the look without aggression or warmth. Simply with the steady clarity of someone who has had 3 years to decide exactly what she thinks. I do not need your approval to continue. I am not asking for your oversight, and I am not interested in a conversation about political necessity. He held her gaze. He did not flinch from it because he had not come this far to perform composure. He felt something in her assessment of him that was accurate, and he was not going to insult it by pretending otherwise. I know, he said quietly. She seemed to register the absence of argument. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not softening exactly, but adjusting. The way a door adjusts when the person pressing against it stops pressing. They sat in silence for a moment that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely hostile. A third thing, provisional and careful. Then he asked, without planning to, without the political calculation that usually preceded his sentences, "Can I stay?" She looked at him. "Not to oversee," he said. "Not to report to the council. To watch. To understand what you are actually doing." He paused. "I have been watching from a ridge for 2 days, and I do not understand it, and I find that I need to." She studied him for a long moment. Then she stood, tucking her notebook into her satchel with the habitual care of someone for whom knowledge is precious cargo. "I do not stop people from watching," she said. She picked up her satchel and moved toward the door. 3 steps from the threshold, the bond pulsed through the room, warm, sudden, undeniable, and she caught herself on the doorframe with one hand for exactly 1 breath. Her knuckles were pale against the wood. Then she straightened, released the frame, and walked out into the cold afternoon without looking back. He sat in the empty cottage and looked at the doorway she had left through and felt the bond settle back into its quiet warmth in his chest and thought, with the clarity of a man who has just understood something irreversible, that he had made the worst decision of his life in 30 seconds 3 years ago, and that whatever came next was going to cost him exactly as much as it should. He could not sleep. The cottage was quiet, the fire banked to coals, his commanders settled in their tents along the ridge above. Sable had commandeered the mill-keeper's storage room as a supply depot with a territorial efficiency that no one had thought to challenge, and Marate had taken the small lean-to attached to the cottage's east wall. And Lyra was somewhere in the village. He knew this through the bond. A directional awareness he had stopped trying to suppress. A low and persistent sense of her presence somewhere to his left and slightly south. Steady and awake and doing something he could not see. He sat outside on the low stone step of the cottage in the dark and the cold, and he let himself remember. He had been deliberately not doing this for 3 years. It was a practiced skill, the redirection of attention away from things that were true and painful, toward things that were manageable and actionable. He was very good at it. He had learned it early. In the specific training ground of a royal childhood, where feeling things too completely was considered a liability, where emotion was a variable to be managed rather than a fact to be reckoned with. He had been managing and reckoning his way through 29 years with considerable efficiency. And the system had served him well enough that he had never seriously questioned it until he watched a woman he had exiled press her hands against a plague stone and redirect an illness that had killed thousands. He made himself go back to the day of the tribunal. Not the sanitized version, the real one. He had been awake since before dawn that morning, which was standard. There had been 7 items requiring resolution before the tribunal convened. A border dispute in the Northern Territories that had escalated overnight. A breakdown in treaty negotiations with the eastern provinces. A communication from his betrothed's political representatives regarding the terms of the formal union agreement that was, at that point, 3 months from signing. 7 items, all of them pressing. All of them requiring his attention and his decisions and his signature on various documents that would move various large and consequential things in various directions. The tribunal had been item 4. He had read the file the night before. He had read it thoroughly, the physician's report, the witness statements, the account of what had happened in the nursery. 3 infants, critical condition, unlikely to survive the night. An unauthorized entry by a junior Omega healer. 6 hours, door locked from the inside. 3 infants, recovered, discharged within the week. He had read it, and he had thought, this is an unusual case. He had thought, the physicians are concerned about protocol. He had thought, and this was the one he could not forgive himself for. With the particular efficiency of a man resolving item 4 of 7. The political situation around the medical corps is already complicated, and I do not have the capacity to fight the physicians' council on this right now. He had not thought, what does she say happened? He had not thought, what does she need me to understand? He had not asked her a single question. He had sat at the head of the tribunal table and watched the physicians present their case, and then watched her given her brief opportunity to respond. She had been calm, he remembered that, unnervingly calm. Her voice steady and her words precise but short because the head physician had interrupted her within 2 minutes on a procedural objection, and he had allowed the objection because he was tired, and because he had already decided, and because item 5 was waiting. The quill had been in his hand before the verdict was formally delivered. He had signed with the automatic efficiency of a man moving through a list. He sat on the cold stone step now, and felt the specific and unadorned shape of what he had done. He had not been cruel. That was the part that was most difficult to reckon with. Cruelty would have been easier to categorize, easier to understand and condemn. He had been efficient. He had been politically convenient. He had taken a living person with an extraordinary gift and a careful mind and a voice that was trying to explain something important. And he had treated her as item 4 of 7, and he had moved on to item 5 without looking back. 3 years. An exile on the southern border. The birds she tracked in her observation journals. The dwelling built into a chalk hillside with walls she had repaired herself. The fox she had saved alone in the underbrush. 10 villages. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and stayed there for a long time. The night was very cold and very quiet. The stars were the same stars that were above Aerith. The same stars that had been above the palace on the night he signed the order. Indifferent and clear, and carrying no opinion about any of it. He thought about what it meant to undo something. He had always understood apology as a transaction, an acknowledgement of error, a correction of course, a return to equilibrium. He was understanding now that some things could not be returned to equilibrium because the equilibrium that existed before was not actually stable. It had been maintained by the silence of someone who had not been given the alternative of being heard. You cannot return to a silence and call it peace. He heard boots on the path and looked up. One of his commanders, Davin, his most senior field officer, was approaching with a careful expression that meant the news was not good. Your Majesty. Davin held out a sealed message. From the capital. The council, sir. It is urgent. He broke the seal and read it in the thin light from the cottage window. His jaw tightened. The head physician had filed a formal petition with 3 senior council members. The petition requested that Lyra Ashveil's exile be made permanent and irrevocable, effective immediately, and that her current activities in the southern quarantine zones be classified as unauthorized practice of royal medicine, an offense carrying significant additional penalty. 3 royal enforcers had already been dispatched south. They were 2 days behind the message. He folded the letter, sat with it in his hands for a moment. Then he stood, straightened his back, and looked out at the dark village around him with the specific expression of a man who has just identified the next thing that needs to be done and is not going to enjoy doing it, but is not going to avoid it either. She was at the well before dawn. He found her there by following the bond, not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. The way you follow a sound you told yourself you were not listening for, and then realize you have been walking toward for several minutes. She was sitting on the well's stone ledge with a cup of something warm between her palms, looking south toward the next village, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The sky was the deep blue of the hour before light, and in it she was a still and solitary shape that the darkness seemed to arrange itself around rather than simply contain. He had the letter in his coat. He had been deciding since before dawn how to tell her. He sat down on the well ledge, leaving 2 feet of stone between them, and said nothing immediately. She did not look at him, but she did not shift away either, which he was learning to read as her version of acknowledgement. They sat in the pre-dawn quiet with the cold and the smell of the south and the low steady pull of the bond between them. And he let the silence be what it was for a moment, rather than filling it with anything official. Then he asked the question he had been carrying since the cottage. "What does it feel like?" he said. "The plague, from the inside of what you do." He paused, wanting to be precise about what he was asking. "Not medically. Not as a description for a report. I want to know what it actually feels like to you." She turned and looked at him. He held the look without explanation or qualification. He had meant it plainly, and he let it be plain. She studied him for a moment in the way she studied everything, with a thorough and unsentimental attention that did not perform warmth but was not cold either, simply accurate. Then she looked back at the southern horizon, and was quiet for long enough that he thought she had decided not to answer. Then she began to speak. "It feels like finding something in a dark room," she said. Her voice was quiet and level, the voice of someone choosing precise words. "Something very large that has been there a long time. It is not evil. That is the first thing I had to understand. When I was young, the plague is not evil any more than a river is evil when it floods. It is simply doing what it does, expanding into available warmth. Following pathways, continuing. It does not want to cause suffering. It does not want anything. Exactly. It has a kind of pressure, a direction. And when I go into the quiet place and reach toward it, I can feel that direction the way you feel wind on your face." She turned her cup slowly between her palms. "The negotiation is not a battle," she continued. "I tried to fight it once, when I was young. The first time I encountered something larger than I had prepared for. Fighting it is like trying to stop a river with your hands. You exhaust yourself, and the river continues. A brief pause. So instead I offer it somewhere to go. Something better than where it is. And I hold that offer open, very steadily, for as long as it takes for the presence to register the direction and begin to follow. The following is never immediate. It is always slow, and the whole time I am holding the offer open. The presence is pressing against my inner frequency with its full weight, which is," she stopped. Considered. "It is very heavy. Each village is heavier than the last." She fell quiet. The sky was beginning to lighten at its lowest edge. A thin line of gray-blue above the southern hills. He had listened without moving, without interjecting, without the evaluating quality that he knew his attention usually carried. The habit of listening for implications and angles and political content. He had simply listened, the way he almost never listened, fully and without agenda. And what she had given him in return was the most interior and unguarded thing he had heard from another person in years. "You have been carrying this alone," he said. "Every time. Every village." "Yes," she said simply. "And before the villages. The fox. The smaller work. All of it alone." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should never have been alone with that." She turned and looked at him again. This time the look was different, not the assessing, careful look of someone taking stock of a potential threat. Something less defended than that. Something that looked, briefly and honestly, like the expression of a person who has not been seen clearly in a very long time and finds the experience both welcome and disorienting. He did not look away. The bond was warm between them in the cold morning air, steadier than it had been since he arrived, as though it recognized something in this moment and was settling into it. Then running footsteps broke the stillness. Sable came around the corner of the well house at a pace that immediately communicated urgency. Without panic, the controlled speed of a child who has learned the difference between situations that require running and situations that require running while still thinking clearly. She stopped in front of them and looked at Lyra directly. "3 men came into the village perimeter an hour ago," she said. "I have been watching them since. They are not scouts. They carry official seals." Her dark eyes moved briefly to Caelan and back to Lyra. "One of them has a writ. He has been asking the villagers where you sleep." Lyra set down her cup on the well ledge. The small sound of it was very precise in the morning quiet. She did not look at Caelan. She was already standing, already reaching for her satchel where it leaned against the well's base. Already straightening with the focused calm of someone who is prepared for this possibility and finds its arrival neither surprising nor particularly frightening. He reached into his coat and took out the letter. "I was going to tell you," he said. She looked at it, then at him. Then, for the first time, something crossed her face that was not quite anger and not quite weariness, but was made of elements of both, refined by 3 years into something very quiet and very clear. "I know," she said. "You always were going to tell me. Eventually." The 3 enforcers were waiting in the village square. They had positioned themselves with the deliberate visibility of men who understood that their authority was, in this particular location, somewhat theoretical, and who had decided that projecting confidence was the best available substitute for actual power. They wore the capital's official gray, the council's seal on their breast, and the carefully composed expressions of people who have been given an unpleasant task and have resolved to execute it without personalizing it. The lead enforcer was a tall man named Gren, who had the weathered competence of someone who had been doing difficult things in difficult places for a long time and had made a kind of peace with the moral complexity of his profession. Lyra walked into the square and stopped 10 feet from them. Caelan came around the corner of the well house 30 seconds behind her, and the dynamic of the square rearranged itself immediately. 3 enforcers recalibrating posture and expression to account for the presence of the king, who was in his base layer rather than his armor, who looked as though he had been awake for a long time, and who walked with the particular focused stillness of someone who has made a decision and is done deliberating about it. Gren looked between them, recovered quickly. "Your Majesty," a correct and efficient bow. Then to Lyra Ashveil, "By order of the Royal Medical Council, you are required to present yourself for inquiry at the capital regarding unauthorized practice of royal medicine," Lyra said. Her voice was perfectly level. "In the active quarantine zones of the Southern Territories, I am familiar with the charge." Gren regarded her. "Then you understand that compliance is required." "I understand that the charge has been filed," she said. Understanding a charge and accepting its legitimacy are different things. Caelan stepped forward, not dramatically, simply moved to a position that placed him adjacent to her rather than behind her, shoulder level, which was a precise and readable signal about where he was standing on the question. Gren registered it, and his composure tightened by a degree. "Enforcer Gren," Caelan said. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who does not need volume to fill a space. "Under what authority does the Medical Council issue warrants in an active military quarantine zone?" Gren produced a folded document. "The Emergency Medical Governance Provision. Your Majesty. Section 14. During a declared health emergency, the Medical Council retains independent jurisdiction over the conduct of medical personnel," Caelan said. "The provision covers credentialed medical personnel operating under council license." He looked at the document without taking it. "Lyra Ashveil holds no council credential. Her license was revoked at exile. Under your own provision, she is a civilian in a military quarantine zone, which places her firmly under military jurisdiction." He paused. "Which is mine?" Gren was quiet for a moment. He was a man who knew his legal architecture well enough to recognize when someone had found a load-bearing gap in it. "The Council's interpretation of the provision is the Council's interpretation," Caelan said, "which I am now formally disputing under the Emergency Military Authority Act, subsection 3, which supersedes Council jurisdiction in declared military quarantine zones. The dispute resolution process requires 48 hours. He met Gren's eyes with the calm of someone who has been navigating legal frameworks since adolescence and does not find them particularly formidable. "You are welcome to remain in the village as observers during that period. You may not execute the writ." Gren looked at him for a long moment. He was calculating, not whether to push back. A man of his experience could see the legal ground clearly enough, but how to frame his report to the council in a way that distributed the responsibility for this setback appropriately. 48 hours, Gren said finally, and the word carried the quality of a door being closed rather than opened. The enforcers withdrew to the village edge. Lyra had not moved during the exchange. She had stood beside Caelan with her satchel over her shoulder and her hands loose at her sides and had watched the legal argument the way she watched everything, with complete attention and no visible reaction. When Gren's back was turned, she looked sideways at Caelan. "The Emergency Military Authority Act," she said quietly. Subsection 3. "It exists," he said. "I did not invent it." "I know it exists," she said. "I read the legal codes during my exile. I had considerable time. She looked at Grenz retreating back. You bought me 48 hours. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I notice you did not say I was innocent. He had no answer for that. The words were accurate, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. And the knowing sat between them in the morning air with the patient solidity of a true thing waiting to be dealt with properly. No, he said. I did not. She nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already assessed, but had needed to verify. Then she shifted her satchel and looked toward the next village on the road south. I have 5 villages left, she said. 48 hours is enough for 2. Perhaps 3 if the outbreaks are less entrenched than the previous ones. She paused. I would suggest you use your 48 hours to contact the capital directly and investigate how the head physician managed to file a permanent exile petition without council majority vote, because based on the council charter, that requires 8 signatures, and I would be very surprised if he has 8. She walked south without waiting for his response. He watched her go. Then he turned to Davin, who had materialized at his shoulder with the invisible efficiency of a good field commander. Davin held out a second sealed message. His expression was the specific expression of a man delivering information he wishes he did not have. Caelan read it. Read it again. The head physician, Davin said quietly. He has been managing the Southern Containment Supply contracts since the outbreak began. Private contracts. Sole source. He lowered his voice further. The quarantine supply orders have been significantly inflated. Someone has been profiting from the plague continuing. Caelan folded the message. Looked south where Lyra had gone. Get me the full contract records, he said. Everything from the last 6 months. He paused. And find out who signed the original quarantine abandonment order. The 7th village was called Veth. It sat at the convergence of 2 old southern trade roads, which had made it prosperous once and made it, now, the point where the plague's various streams had pooled into something denser and more complex than anything Lyra had encountered in the previous 6 villages. She knew this before she entered. She could feel it from the road outside the perimeter, the pressure of it against her awareness, heavier than usual, with a quality she could not immediately name, but that made her slow her pace and stand at the gate for longer than she normally did before going in. Something was different about this one. She went in anyway, because the alternative was not going in. And that was not something she was capable of choosing while people were still alive inside. She found her position in the village square, a low stone platform that had once served as the base of a market weighing station. Now bare and cold, and she settled into the familiar sequence. Knees on stone. Palms flat, eyes closed. The transition to the quiet place, which was becoming faster with each village. The pathway worn smooth by repetition the way a frequently traveled road becomes easier to walk. The plague presence rose to meet her. And she stopped. She stayed very still in the quiet place, and she felt what she was feeling with the careful precision of a healer who has learned that the first reading of a symptom is not always the correct reading, and that the impulse to categorize quickly is one of the most dangerous impulses in medicine. She felt it again, and again. It was wrong. Not wrong in the way of a particularly virulent or entrenched outbreak. She had felt those now in 6 consecutive villages, and she knew their quality. The wild and directionless pressure of an illness following its natural pathways. This was different in a way that was subtle but, once perceived, unmistakable. A natural outbreak felt like weather, unintentional, following the path of least resistance. Responding to the landscape of available hosts with the blind efficiency of something that has no plan, because it has no awareness. It felt like a river finding its own course downhill. What she felt in Veth did not feel like a river finding its course. It felt like a river that had been dug. There was a structure to it, faint, partially dissolved by the weeks that had passed since the outbreak's origin. The way a handprint in wet clay dissolves as the clay dries, but leaves a trace of its direction in the hardened surface if you know how to look. She had never felt a seeded plague before. She had read about them in her mother's oldest journals, references to historical incidents. Wars in which illness had been deliberately introduced into enemy populations. The particular fingerprint that deliberate seeding left in the plague's energetic signature. She had read those entries with the detached interest of a scholar studying something ancient and theoretical. The fingerprint in Veth was not ancient. She sat with it for a long time, longer than the negotiation required, turning the perception over in her inner awareness with the methodical patience of someone who needs to be absolutely certain before they say what they are about to say. She was certain within the first hour. She continued for a second hour anyway, mapping the structure of the seeding as precisely as she could, its origin point, which the plague's internal direction still faintly indicated the way a weather vane still points after the wind has shifted, and its method, which was water. The border water systems. The confluence point where the two trade roads' shared water source fed into both the Solon River, tributaries, and the wells of the southern administrative center. One release point. Approximately 3 months ago. Everything that had followed, every village, every death, every quarantine banner, every family behind a shuttered door, flowing outward from that single deliberate act. She brought herself back to the negotiation, finished it, guided the plague into the earth with the same patience she always brought to the work. Perhaps more steadily than usual, because the anger she was feeling was the kind that clarified rather than disrupted, the cold and focused kind that she had always found easier to work with than the hot variety. When she walked out of Veth, the sky was turning the deep orange of late afternoon, and her legs were carrying her with the careful mechanical reliability of a body that has used most of its available resources and is operating on the remainder. Caelan was at the perimeter. He had been there for the last 3 villages, not inside the line. Respecting the protocol he had finally accepted, she maintained for reasons of concentration, rather than exclusion, standing at the perimeter gate when she came out, which she had also stopped pretending not to find steadying. She walked to him and stopped. She did not sit down, though she wanted to. She needed to say this standing. "The plague in Veth is different from the others," she said. She kept her voice clinical, the way she kept her hands steady during a negotiation, not because she was not feeling things, but because precision was more useful than feeling right now. "I can sense the origin point of an outbreak through the plague's internal direction. The way it flows tells you where it started. The same way a river's current tells you where the water source is." He was very still, listening with the full attention she had come to recognize as his real attention, the kind without agenda. "The plague in Veth did not start naturally," she said. "It was introduced, deliberately, into the border water confluence approximately 3 months ago." She watched his face. One release point. One act. Everything else followed from that. He went the specific still of a man whose mind has just locked onto a piece of information and is rapidly connecting it to other pieces of information he already holds. She watched the connections happen behind his eyes. "The head physician," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "I cannot tell you a name," she said. "I can tell you a method and a location and a time frame. You have the contract records." He looked at her. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before, a controlled and interior devastation. The expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had hoped would not be confirmed. 3 months ago, he said, the physician submitted the initial quarantine abandonment recommendation to the council, 2 weeks before the outbreak was publicly declared. He stopped. He knew. He knew because he had already. He stopped again. She waited. 3 years ago, he said very quietly. The exile charges. The nursery incident. He looked at her with an expression she had no immediate category for. He filed those charges as well. The hillside was very quiet around them. The orange light was deepening toward dark. Below them, the village of Veth lay still and cleared, the plague gone from it. The people inside beginning the slow process of opening their doors. She closed her eyes for one breath. 3 years, 10,000 people, one man, and a kingdom that had handed him the tools. And a king who had handed him her. She opened her eyes. Caelan was watching her with an expression that was not asking for forgiveness. He was past that. She realized, past the stage where absolution was what he was seeking. He was simply standing in the full knowledge of what he had been part of, without flinching from it, which was something she had not expected from him, and which she filed carefully in the part of her mind that was still deciding what he was. 5 villages left, she said. Yes, he said. She reached for her satchel. He did not stop her, but as she turned toward the road, he said her name, just her name, nothing attached to it, no title or request or justification. Simply her name in a voice that was not performing anything at all. She stopped walking, but did not turn around. "I know," she said. She walked toward the next village as the last of the orange light left the sky. The city of Valdemir did not look like a city anymore. It had been once the administrative and cultural heart of the Southern Territories, a place of wide stone streets and cooperative halls, and a market that drew traders from 3 provinces. A healer's college that had trained half the Southern medical practitioners for 2 generations. A population of nearly 4,000 people who had built something genuinely worth having in the far south where the kingdom's attention rarely reached. Now its gates were sealed with triple quarantine banners, its streets were silent. And the plague presence that Lyra could feel from the road outside was unlike anything she had encountered in the previous 9 villages combined. It was not simply larger. It was older, more settled. The plague had been in Valdemir longest. She knew. The outbreak had originated in the water confluence 3 months ago, and Valdemir, sitting directly at that confluence, had been the first place it touched and the deepest place it had taken hold. 3 months of entrenchment in a city of 4,000 meant the presence was not just dense, but structured in the way of something that had had time to establish itself, to find its pathways and deepen them, to become less like a tide and more like a geography. She stood at the gate for a long time. Caelan stood beside her. He did not speak. He had learned, over the past days, that the moments before she entered a village were not moments for speech. That she was doing something during them that looked like standing still, and was actually the first stage of the preparation. The settling of her inner frequency into the quiet place's outer edges before she needed it fully. He had learned to simply be present in those moments without demanding anything from them. She appreciated this more than she had expected to. She went in. The city was vast and silent in the way of places that have forgotten ordinary sound. Her boots on the stone streets were the only footsteps. Here and there, through shuttered windows, she could feel the presence of people, alive, still alive, she told herself. The bond between healer and patient that she had always felt more strongly than any other bond. The particular resonance of life that is diminished but still present. She walked to the center of the city, to the old cooperative hall where the healer's college had once operated, and she found its central courtyard, a wide, open space with a stone floor worn smooth by decades of foot traffic and a well at its center that was, she knew from the old southern maps she had memorized, directly above the deepest point of the water confluence below. She knelt. The preparation took longer than usual. She had to go deeper into the quiet place than she had ever gone before to reach the full extent of the presence here. Had to extend her inner frequency outward in every direction simultaneously rather than concentrating it in one point. Had to hold more of herself open and available to the negotiation than she had ever held at once. It was like opening every window and door in a house at the same time in the middle of a storm. Everything rushed in. The full weight of the presence pressing through every available channel of her awareness with a force that was not malicious but was enormous. And she had to keep every channel open without being swept through them. She hummed. The tone rose and steadied, and she held it with everything she had. The hours passed. She lost track of her body in the second hour, could no longer feel the cold stone under her knees or the weight of her own hands. She lost track of her name in the 4th hour, which had happened once before briefly, in the 3rd village, but this time it lasted longer. The boundary between herself and the negotiation becoming permeable in a way that frightened her in a distant and abstract way. The way you are frightened by something you can see at the edge of your vision and cannot quite look at directly. In the 5th hour, she felt the first real pull. It was not the plague pulling at her, not an aggressive force trying to take something. It was subtler than that, and in some ways more dangerous. It was simply the weight of the negotiation creating a gravity of its own. The same gravity that had taken her mother in the 3rd village along the Solon River. The slow and terrible exhaustion of holding something enormous in place for so long that the question of where the holding ends and the holder begins loses its clarity. She felt herself beginning to dissolve at the edges. She reached for her anchor. In previous negotiations, the anchor had been abstract, a concept, a purpose, the faces of the people inside the houses. She reached for those, and they were there, but they were pale, insufficient, too distant from the immediacy of what was pulling at her edges. She needed something closer, something present. Then she heard his voice. Not with her ears. Through the bond, directly, unmistakably. The specific and irreducible quality of Caelan's presence outside the quarantine line pressing through the bond with an urgency that was not calling her name in the literal sense, but was doing something that felt exactly like it. The desperate and unguarded transmission of someone who has been watching a window for 7 hours and has started to be very afraid of what the continuing silence means. She used it like a handhold. She wrapped her inner awareness around the bond's signal and pulled herself back along it, back toward the surface of herself, back toward her name and her body and the cold stone and the weight of her hands. The plague presence, feeling her begin to withdraw her full attention from the negotiation, shifted, and she redirected it, sharply and with more authority than she had used in any previous session, pointing it hard toward the earth below the well, toward the deep stone and mineral cold beneath the water confluence where it had originated, sending it home to dissolve. She felt it go. All of it, the full weight of 3 months and 4,000 people and one deliberate poisoning, moving out of the living city and into the permanent cold of the deep earth below. The silence that followed was the most complete she had ever heard. She became aware of herself again, of her knees on the stone, of her hands numb and shaking, of the sound of a door opening somewhere in the city, and then another door, and then a voice, a child's voice, high and clear, calling a name into the open air with the particular sound of someone who has not been sure. Until this moment, that calling out would find anyone left to answer. She stood. Her knees held for exactly 2 steps past the cooperative hall's courtyard gate before they did not. She was already falling when the arms came around her. He had crossed the quarantine line. She registered this distantly, with the detached observation of someone operating at the very edge of available consciousness. He had crossed the quarantine line and come into the city, and was now kneeling on the stone street with her weight against his chest, and one hand at the back of her head, and his voice saying her name, out loud this time. Not through the bond, simply her name in a voice that had no composure left in it at all. She did not pull away. For the first time, she did not pull away. She woke to canvas above her. The tent was his. She understood this before she was fully conscious. The bond orienting her to him the way a compass needle orients to north. A directional certainty that required no deliberate thought. His cloak was folded over her with a careful precision that suggested it had been done slowly and with attention. The way you do something when you are not sure if you are allowed to do it, and want to do it well enough to justify having done it. She lay still for a moment and looked at the canvas ceiling and took stock of herself. Her hands were wrapped. Someone had bandaged them while she slept. Not from injury, there were no wounds. But the skin of her palms was the particular raw and oversensitive state that always followed an extended negotiation session. As though the effort of conducting something vast through her hands had thinned the boundary between inside and outside, and the ordinary world felt too present against it. The bandaging was competent. She suspected Marate, who had a healer's practical knowledge even without the gift. She was very tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of physical effort, but the deeper kind. The tiredness that lived behind her eyes and in the center of her chest, and that required not simply sleep but time. The slow accumulation of ordinary hours and ordinary meals and ordinary air until the inner frequency rebuilt itself to full capacity. She had known this tiredness before, after the 3-village session of her training years, and she knew that it passed. She also knew it was dangerous to push through it. She sat up carefully. The bond told her he was outside, close, pacing. She could feel the pacing through it, not a visual impression, but a kinetic one. The particular rhythm of a large and restless thing moving back and forth in a confined space. She knew that rhythm by now. She had been watching it from the outside for days, and was learning its meaning. He paced when he was containing something he had not yet decided how to release. She called his name. He was inside the tent before the second syllable had finished, which told her he had been very close to the entrance, and had been waiting with considerably less patience than he had been performing for the past several days. He stopped just inside the tent flap and looked at her, sitting upright, wrapped in his cloak, her bandaged hands in her lap. Her hair loose around her shoulders, and some of the contained thing in his face released itself in a slow exhale that he probably had not intended to be visible. He sat down across from her, cross-legged on the tent floor. At the distance that had become their habitual distance, close enough for the bond to run warm between them. Far enough that neither of them was obligated by proximity. "How long?" she said. 14 hours, he said. She absorbed this. 14 hours was longer than she had expected. Longer than she had been unconscious after any previous session. "The city," she said. "Is clear," he said. Sable sent a runner in at first light to confirm. The first families began opening their doors before dawn. He paused. "There are people walking in the streets of Valdemir this morning who have not left their houses in 3 months. She looked at her bandaged hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "You crossed the quarantine line," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not offer justification or apology. He simply confirmed the fact with the directness of someone who had made the choice fully aware of its nature and had not regretted it. "Your quarantine protocol requires." "I know what it requires," he said. "I wrote it." She studied him. He met the study without deflection, which she had come to recognize as one of the few things he did consistently that she had not expected from him. She had expected a king who managed scrutiny the way powerful men usually managed it, by controlling the angle of it, presenting a surface rather than a substance. He did not do that. When she looked at him directly, he looked back directly, and what she saw was not a surface. It was a man sitting with the full weight of what he knew about himself and not moving away from it. "I heard you," she said quietly. "Through the bond. In the 7th hour. When I was losing the boundary." She paused. "Your voice brought me back." Something moved through his expression, not surprise, because she suspected he had felt the moment too, but the particular quality of a confirmed thing. Something that has been true and unspoken, and is now true and spoken, and cannot be unspoken. "I know," he said. I felt the moment you started to." He stopped. "Tried again. I was very afraid." She looked at him for a long moment. She was making a decision, she knew. Not the large decision, that one was still forming. Still requiring the kind of careful time that large decisions required. But a smaller one. The decision to allow this particular honesty to be met with honesty. "So was I," she said. He leaned forward slightly. Not toward her physically, the distance between them did not change. But toward her in the way that attention leans forward, with the whole of itself rather than a managed portion. "Lyra, I need to tell you about the day I signed the order." "I know what you did," she said. "You know the facts of it," he said. His voice was quiet and without defense. "You do not know what I felt afterward." She looked at him. She thought about her mother's journal entry, the one she had read beside the fire on the night before Aerith. "I should have been less afraid of being known." She thought about what it meant to let someone speak a thing that they needed to speak. Not for absolution, but for the simpler and more necessary reason that truth requires air to remain true. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He did not spare himself in the telling. He spoke about item 4 of 7, about the political calculation that had stood in for conscience. About the specific moment when he had understood, not immediately, not that day, but slowly over the months that followed. In the accumulating weight of a decision that refused to stay filed, that what he had signed was not a policy document, but a person's life. He spoke about the 3 years of not looking at it directly, because looking at it directly meant acknowledging that the man he believed himself to be was not entirely the man he was. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the tent was very quiet. She did not offer forgiveness. She was not ready to offer forgiveness, and he was not asking for it. She could see that clearly. Could see that he had not told her this in order to receive something from her, but simply because it was true, and she deserved to have it be said. That distinction mattered enormously. "I heard you," she said finally. "Not I forgive you. Not it is all right." Simply the acknowledgement that his truth had been received by someone who was paying full attention. He nodded once. Then his commander burst through the tent flap with the controlled urgency of a man who has been waiting for the patient moment to interrupt, and has concluded that the patient moment is not coming. "Your Majesty." Davin's voice was tight. "The head physician has fled the capital." He took evidence files from the medical council archive. 3 days ago. He paused, and the pause carried weight. "And the council, 4 members have signed a new warrant. Not for inquiry this time." His eyes moved briefly to Lyra and back to the king. "For immediate and permanent arrest. The royal guard has been dispatched. They are one day behind us. The tent was very still. Lyra looked at Caelan. He was already standing. The royal guard arrived at noon. They came down the southern road in formal formation, 12 riders in the kingdom's deep blue. The crown seal on their breastplates catching the winter light with the particular cold gleam of things that have been polished to communicate authority rather than for any practical purpose. They were competent, professional, and operating under orders that had been issued by 4 council members in the capital without the king's knowledge or approval. A jurisdictional overreach of significant proportions that everyone present understood and that no one had yet said aloud. The people of Valdemir had been coming out of their houses since dawn. This was the thing the council had not accounted for, had perhaps not known to account for, sitting in the capital 3 days' ride north. Making administrative decisions about a southern population they had already written off as a sacrifice zone. The people of Valdemir and the surrounding villages, people who had been inside for 3 months, who had watched their families sicken and their neighbors die and their city go silent around them, had spent the morning doing what people do when an enormous weight is suddenly lifted. They came outside and they stood in the air and they looked at each other with the particular expression of people rediscovering that other people exist and that this is a remarkable and sustaining thing. And then they had heard that the woman who had walked through 10 quarantine villages without a mask, who had knelt in their streets and pressed her hands to their stones and stayed for 7 hours when most would have stayed for 7 minutes, was going to be arrested. They gathered in the administrative square without being asked. They did not come with weapons or organized intent. They came the way people come to witness something that concerns them, quietly, in ones and twos and small family clusters, standing in the cold with their recovered breath and their clear eyes and their presence, which was the only argument they had, and which turned out to be a considerable one. By the time the royal guard rode into the square, there were several hundred people standing in it. Lyra was already there. She had chosen her position without drama, standing on the low stone steps of the administrative hall, slightly elevated. Not for theatrical effect, but because she had learned over years of speaking to frightened people in difficult circumstances that height communicates calm. That people who are afraid look upward instinctively. That if she was going to speak, she wanted them to be able to see her face. She had her satchel over her shoulder and her bandaged hands loose at her sides, and she was wearing the same practical working clothes she had worn through every village because she had not thought to bring anything else, and because it seemed, in any case, appropriate. Caelan was in the square, but not beside her. This had been her choice, and he had accepted it without argument. She had told him, that morning in the tent while Davin waited outside, "This confrontation needs to be mine first. If you stand beside me from the beginning, what the people see is a king protecting a subject. What I need them to see is a healer standing on her own ground." He had looked at her for a moment and then nodded. And she had known in that nod that he understood the difference, and that his understanding of it was one of the things she was beginning, carefully and without rushing, to trust about him. The lead guard captain read the warrant. His voice was official and correct, and entirely devoid of any awareness of the irony of reading an arrest warrant in a public square to a crowd of people who were alive because of the person being arrested. When he finished, the square was completely silent. Lyra spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The silence was already so complete that ordinary speech carried to every edge of the gathered crowd. She began with the clinical facts, because the clinical facts were the foundation, and without a foundation nothing built on top of it would hold. She described what she had found in the 7th village. The structured quality of the plague presence. The origin point in the border water confluence. The time frame, 3 months ago. Precisely coordinated with the initial quarantine abandonment recommendation. She used the precise and specific language of a trained healer giving testimony. Because this was testimony, and she understood that. The crowd listened with the absolute attention of people receiving information that explains something enormous that they have been living inside without understanding. Then she described what it felt like to negotiate with a seeded plague versus a natural one. She did not simplify it for the crowd or make it dramatic. She described it the way she had described it to Caelan at the well in the pre-dawn dark, with honesty and precision. And the honesty was more powerful than any drama could have been because the people listening had been inside those houses, and they recognized the truth of suffering described accurately. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then Caelan stepped forward. He came from the edge of the square where he had been standing among the crowd, not above it, not separated from it, and he walked to the steps of the administrative hall, and he stopped beside her, and he turned to face the gathered people. He was not in his armor. He was in the base layer he had been wearing since he crossed the quarantine line the night before, slightly travel-worn. Entirely unroyal in his presentation, and entirely himself in a way that his presentation had rarely allowed before. He reached up and removed his crown. He held it in both hands. It was a plain thing, as crowns went. Heavy gold, no jewels, functional rather than decorative. A working crown rather than a ceremonial one. And he held it the way you hold something whose weight you are, for the first time, fully feeling. He spoke without preamble, without the formal rhetorical structure that royal addresses usually followed, without the managed cadence of a man who has prepared his words for maximum political effect. 3 years ago, he said, I signed an exile order in 30 seconds. A woman stood in front of me and tried to explain what she could do, and I did not ask her a single question. I had 7 things on my list that morning, and she was the 4th. His voice did not waver. I was wrong, not in a complicated political sense. Simply wrong. A person who deserved to be heard was not heard because I did not make the time to hear her. The square was absolutely silent. The man who brought the charges against her 3 years ago is the same man who introduced the plague into the southern water confluence 3 months ago and then submitted the quarantine. Abandonment recommendation that ensured no royal resources would be sent to address it. He paused. He has been profiting from supply contracts tied to the plague's continuation. This is documented. The investigation is already underway. He looked at the crown in his hands. I will not wear this again, he said, until the laws that allowed all of this, the exile provisions, the council's independent warrant authority, the sole source contract system, the credentialing rules that exclude healers without political patronage are changed, not revised, changed. He set the crown down on the stone wall beside the steps. The square erupted. Not into chaos, into sound, the particular roar of people who have been silent for too long releasing something enormous into the open air. Voices overlapping in the way of a crowd that has been holding a collective breath and has finally been given permission to let it out. Lyra stood beside him in the sound of it and looked at him with an expression she could feel on her own face and could not entirely control. Not yet forgiveness. She was honest enough to know that forgiveness was a larger country than she had yet traveled the full extent of, but something real and specific and newly possible. The beginning of trust. The first careful crossing of a bridge she had not been sure would hold. He looked back at her. He did not smile. He simply looked at her with the same directness he always brought to her attention when she turned it on him fully. And in that directness she could see that he was not performing any of this. Not the speech, not the crown on the wall, not the look. It was all simply true. The guard captain had not moved to execute the warrant. He was a practical man and the arithmetic of the situation, a king who had just publicly committed to legislative reform, a crowd of several hundred recovered plague survivors, and a warrant from 4 council members whose authority was, at this precise moment, highly questionable, was not arithmetic that favored action. He folded his orders, looked at the crown on the wall, looked at the crowd. The capital had never seen anything quite like what arrived from the south that winter. It came not as an army or a formal delegation, but as something harder to dismiss and harder to contain, a story, carried north by every courier and recovered southerner and soldier who had stood on the ridge above Valdenmere and watched a woman kneel in a plague city for 7 hours and walk out on her own 2 feet. Stories travel faster than horses when they carry the particular weight of witnessed truth. And this one arrived in the capital's taverns and guild halls and domestic kitchens days before the official dispatches did, which meant that by the time Lyra Ashveil walked into the capital's formal tribunal hall for the second time in her life, the city already knew her name. This time, she walked in through the front door. The tribunal hall looked exactly as she remembered it, the high stone ceiling, the elevated head table. The witness platform positioned at the center of the room, with the particular deliberateness of an architecture designed to make individuals feel the weight of institutional judgment pressing down from above. She had stood on that platform 3 years ago and felt small against it. She stood on it now and felt something entirely different, not large exactly. Not the performed confidence of someone trying to project power they do not possess, but grounded. The specific solidity of someone who knows exactly what they are there to do and has no remaining doubt about whether they should be doing it. Caelan sat in the gallery. This had required a separate and somewhat pointed negotiation. He had recused himself from the proceeding entirely, not grudgingly but with the specific intention of making the recusal meaningful, of ensuring that no record or memory of this tribunal would carry the suggestion that its outcome had been shaped by royal presence at the head table. He sat in the gallery among the observers with his crown absent from his head and a council of 3 independent legal arbiters occupying the positions of judgment that would normally have been his. He had arranged this himself, over the objection of 2 senior court officials who felt it was unseemly, and he had explained his reasoning in the precise and irrefutable terms of a man who had recently learned something important about the difference between protecting a process and controlling an outcome. The proceeding opened with the formal charges against the head physician, who had been captured 3 days after his flight from the capital. Found in a border province with a traveling case full of evidence he had apparently intended to destroy and had not yet managed to. The evidence had been catalogued and preserved by Davin's field team with the methodical competence that characterized everything Davin did. And it was comprehensive: contract records, communication logs, the original seating authorization written in the head physician's own hand in a private cipher that his clerk, under questioning, had translated without hesitation. The case against him did not require Lyra's testimony to be complete, but she gave it anyway. She stood on the witness platform and she spoke for 2 hours. She began with the nursery 3 years ago, the 3 infants, the 6 hours, the gift she had used fully for the first time at that scale, and the way she had emerged from the nursery to find not celebration but accusation. She described the experience of her gift in the clinical language she had used at Valdenmere, and then she set the clinical language aside and described it in the honest language she had used at the well with Caelan. Because the tribunal needed to understand not only what she had done but what it had cost, and cost was not a clinical category. She described the exile. Not with anger. She had made a deliberate choice about the register of this testimony. Had decided in the days of travel and preparation leading up to it that anger, however legitimate, would allow people to file her account under the category of grievance rather than the category of evidence. She described the exile with the same precision she brought to every observation, as a sequence of events with causes and effects and documented outcomes, and she let the precision do what anger would have done less effectively. She described the 10 villages. She described what she had found in Veth, the seated origin, the deliberate structure, the fingerprint of the physician's act still present in the plague's internal direction 3 months after the release. She described the connection between the exile charges 3 years ago and the seating 3 months ago, how the same man, using the same mechanism of institutional authority exercised without adequate oversight, had first silenced the one healer who could have identified what he was doing and then done it. The hall was devastated. Not loudly, silently, which was worse, the silence of people absorbing something that required the reordering of what they had believed was true about how their institutions worked and who they protected. When she finished, the chief arbitrator asked her one question. In your assessment, were there structural failures that allowed this to occur beyond the actions of one individual? She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. The exile provisions allow indefinite removal of healers from practice on the authority of a single institutional complaint without independent review. The credentialing system creates a dependency on political patronage that can be weaponized by anyone who controls the credential. The council's independent warrant authority operates without oversight during declared emergencies. And the sole source contract system, she paused. The sole source contract system meant that a man who stood to profit from the plague's continuation was also the man advising the council on plague management. These are not individual failures. They are architectural ones. The hall absorbed this. The physician was sentenced 3 days after the tribunal closed, a full formal conviction on charges that included deliberate introduction of biological harm, abuse of institutional authority, and fraudulent procurement, among others. It was the most significant conviction the kingdom's legal system had produced in 2 decades, and it required changes to that system simply by virtue of what it revealed about the system's prior operation. Lyra did not attend the sentencing. She was in the council chamber instead, at a long table covered in documents, working with 3 legal scholars, 2 Southern Territorial representatives, and an Omega healer from the western provinces named Dresh, who had traveled 6 days to be present and whose quiet, methodical intelligence was one of the finest things Lyra had encountered in years. They were drafting the initial framework of what would become the Southern Healer Accord, the new system of recognition, protection, and independent oversight for healers, with particular provisions for practitioners of rare gifts, built specifically on the structural failures she had described in her testimony. It was the most demanding intellectual work she had ever done, and she had never been more fully present for anything in her life. Caelan appeared in the council chamber doorway at the end of the 2nd day. He did not enter without invitation. He had developed a finely calibrated sense, over the past weeks, of when to enter and when to wait, and this was a waiting moment. He stood in the doorway and looked at her across the room, surrounded by documents and colleagues, and the specific productive disorder of people building something from scratch. And something in his face had the quality of a man looking at something that is exactly what it should be, and finding this more moving than he had anticipated. She looked up and saw him there. She said something to Dresh, a quiet sentence that produced a nod and a brief reshuffling of the documents between them, and then she stood and crossed the room to the doorway. "The arbiters have approved the first 3 provisions," she said. "I know," he said. "Davin told me." He paused. "How much longer tonight?" She looked back at the table, at Dresh and the legal scholars still deep in the framework language. "Another 2 hours at least." He nodded. He reached into his coat and produced a small cloth-wrapped package, bread and something warm. She could feel the heat through the wrapping. He handed it to her without ceremony. She took it, looked at it in her hands for a moment. "You have been bringing me food for a week," she said. "You forget to eat when you are working," he said. "I know," she said. "My mother had the same problem." It was the first time she had told him anything about her mother unprompted. She saw him register it, the small careful attention that he gave to things she offered voluntarily, the way he received them without pressing for more than was given. "Go back inside," he said quietly. "The framework will not write itself." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the table, the warm package in her bandaged hands. And the corridor outside the council chamber was very still, and he stood in it for a long moment after she had gone back inside, looking at the doorway, before he finally turned and walked away. Spring came to the capital like an exhale. The snow that had covered the southern road for the duration of the tribunal proceedings melted in the first weeks after the conviction, and the mud that followed it dried. And the bare trees along the capital's outer boulevard put out their first tentative leaves with the mild and unhurried confidence of things that do not require anyone's permission to begin again. Lyra noticed the leaves from the window of the council chamber, where she had been working for 6 weeks, and felt something in her chest ease slightly at the sight of them. The way something eases when a season changes, and you realize you had been unconsciously waiting for it to. The Southern Healer Accord had taken its final shape over those 6 weeks through a process that was equal parts rigorous and exhausting and occasionally heated. Because good things built by multiple people always involve the friction of multiple perspectives rubbing against each other, until something truer than any single perspective emerges. Lyra had learned to work in that friction, to hold her own positions precisely, and without apology, while remaining genuinely open to being shown where they needed adjustment, which was a different skill from debating, and a harder one, requiring the specific combination of confidence and intellectual humility that she suspected was the real qualification for any kind of leadership. Dresh had been invaluable. So had the 2 Southern Territorial representatives, who brought the practical knowledge of people who had lived inside the broken system and knew exactly where its edges cut. So had the legal scholars, who knew the architecture of the kingdom's existing law well enough to find the load-bearing points that needed to change and the decorative elements that could be altered without structural consequence. The accord contained 11 provisions. The first 3 addressed credentialing, a new independent body, separate from the medical council, with authority to recognize and protect healers of rare gifts without requiring them to navigate a political patronage system. The next 4 addressed oversight, mandatory independent review of any exile or practice suspension, a public record of all medical council decisions, and a sunset clause on the emergency medical governance provision that had given the council its unchecked warrant authority during the crisis. The final 4 were the ones Lyra had fought hardest for, specific protections for Omega healers, who had historically faced the highest rates of credential denial and exile, a prohibition on sole source medical contracts during declared emergencies, a requirement that all quarantine abandonment decisions be independently reviewed within 72 hours, and the establishment of the Equal Healer Council, a governing body of 12 representatives drawn from every territory and designated rank, with no single political authority capable of overruling its majority decisions. Caelan had sat on the council that reviewed and ratified the accord. He had sat as one voice among 12, precisely as the provision specified, and he had spoken 3 times during the ratification proceedings, once to support a provision that had been challenged by a Northern Territorial representative, once to ask a clarifying question about the implementation timeline, and once to say, very directly, that the provision protecting Omega healers should be strengthened rather than weakened in its final language, and that he would not be supporting the diluted version that 3 council members were proposing. The provision was not diluted. On the evening after the final ratification session, Lyra walked out of the council building into the spring evening and stood on the front steps and breathed the air, which smelled of new leaves and the river and the particular clean coldness of a capital city in early spring. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for something this complicated and this earned. Something more like rightness. The specific sensation of being in the correct place doing the correct thing, which she had felt in fleeting moments throughout her life, but had never sustained for long enough to trust. She heard the door behind her. She did not turn around. She knew who it was through the bond, which had settled over the past weeks into something that no longer felt like a pull or a pressure or an ache, but simply like a warm and constant presence. The way you are always aware of a fire in a room, even when you are not looking at it directly. He came to stand beside her on the steps. They looked out at the spring evening together for a moment. It passed, she said. All 11 provisions, he said. Unanimous on 9, majority on 2. The Omega Protection Provision and the Sole Source Prohibition. 2 Northern Council members objected on commercial grounds. He paused. They were overruled. She nodded. The evening was very quiet around them. What happens now? He said. Not a question exactly. More like the beginning of a conversation. He had been waiting for the right moment to begin. She had been thinking about this for weeks. Not avoiding it. She was not a person who avoided things she had decided to face, but giving it the time it required, which was the same patience she gave to everything important. She had been watching him across council chambers and doorways, and the specific domestic geography of 2 people moving through the same days. Watching him be consistently and unglamorously himself in every context she had seen him in since the South, and what she had seen had not been a performance. It had been a man doing the difficult and ongoing work of being accountable, without using accountability as a performance, which was a distinction that mattered enormously to her. She had also been watching herself, noticing what happened in her chest when she heard his footsteps in a corridor, noticing that she had stopped steeling herself against the bond and had started simply feeling it, which was a different posture entirely. She looked sideways at him. He was looking at her with the directness that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he cared about, without management or calculation, and the caring was visible in it the way light is visible in glass. She reached across the space between them and set her hand over his. He looked down at their hands, then up at her. Something in his face did the thing it had done in the cottage in Wren's mill, the thing she had not had a word for then, and thought she had won for now. It was not relief. It was recognition. The specific look of someone arriving at a place they have been traveling toward for a long time and finding it exactly as real as they had hoped it would be. Neither of them spoke for a moment. His hand turned under hers and held it, carefully, aware of the bandaging that was still present, still needed. The healing that was still ongoing, and that he treated as a fact rather than a complication. "The Southern Healer Academy," she said finally. "I want to open it in Valdemir, in the Healers College building. The one that was abandoned when the plague hit. It needs significant repair, but the structure is sound." She paused. "I want the first class to include 12 Omega healers who were denied credentialing under the old system. I have already identified 7 of them." "Done," he said without hesitation. She looked at him. "I have not finished the list of conditions." Something moved in his eyes that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "I know," he said. "I said done to indicate that the list of conditions is not going to encounter resistance from my direction. You may continue." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the spring evening and continued. She told him about the sanctuary, the protected practice space she wanted built adjacent to the academy, governed by the Equal Healer Council, and therefore outside the reach of any single political authority, where healers with rare gifts could practice and develop their gifts without the constant threat of institutional interference. She told him about Sable, who had written her a letter from the south asking when the academy would open because she intended to be in the first class and needed adequate notice to prepare. She told him about Dresh, who had agreed to serve as the academy's first deputy administrator if Lyra would serve as its head. He listened to all of it with the full and unmanaged attention that was one of the things she had decided she trusted most about him. When she finished, the spring evening had deepened to the first blue of dusk, and the new leaves on the boulevard trees were very still in the quiet air. "There is something I want to tell you," he said. She waited. "The morning I signed the exile order," he said. "Item 4 of 7. I have thought about that morning every day since Valdemir. About what I would have done if I had." He stopped. Started again. "I do not know if I would have been capable, then, of making the right choice. I want to believe I would have been. I do not know that I was the person, then, who was capable of it." He looked at her with the steady honesty that had become, she realized, one of the things she relied on without having decided to. "I think I am closer to being that person now. I think," a pause, "I think you are part of the reason for that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. She turned her hand in his, not releasing it, holding it differently, with the specific intention of someone who has made a choice and is communicating the choice through the holding. The bond settled between them like a long and patient breath, finally fully released. They stood together in the spring dusk and did not need to say anything else, because the things that needed to be said had been said, and the things that did not need to be said were present in the warm and steady space between them in a way that required no translation. Then the door behind them opened. Davin's voice, "Your Majesty." Lyra Ashveil. The careful, slightly apologetic tone of a man interrupting something he recognizes as significant. "The northern messenger has arrived. Word from the Highland territories." A pause. "There are reports of a new illness beginning in 3 Highland villages. Unusual symptom. Progression. The local healers are requesting. They are requesting her specifically." Lyra looked at Caelan. He looked at her. She was already reaching for her satchel with her free hand. He tightened his hand around hers briefly, not stopping her. Simply the acknowledgement of a man who has learned the difference between holding someone and holding someone back. Then he let go. "I am coming with you," he said. She considered this for exactly one breath. "You will need different boots," she said. "The Highland roads are not southern roads." "I have different boots," he said. "Of course you do," she said. She walked back into the building to collect her things. And for the first time in 3 years she was not walking away from something. She was walking toward it, and the difference was everything. 1 year later, the Healers' College in Valdemir had new windows. They were tall and south-facing, installed specifically to catch the maximum available light through the short southern winter days. And in the early morning they filled the central hall with a quality of illumination that was warm and honest, and without pretension, the light of a working space rather than a ceremonial one. Which was exactly what Lyra had asked the builders for when they had come to her with options for the restoration. She had not wanted a monument. She had wanted a room where people could see clearly what they were doing. On the morning of the academy's first day, she stood at the front of that room and looked at 40 faces. They were not all young. She had anticipated this, had planned for it, in fact, deliberately designing the Academy's first class to include experienced practitioners who had been practicing without credential for years. Healers who had built their knowledge in the margins of the official system and whose expertise was real and deep and entirely unrecognized. The oldest student in the first class was a woman of 63 named Hesra, a midwife and herbal practitioner from the far southern border who had delivered nearly 400 babies and treated countless illnesses over 4 decades without a single formal credential. Because the credentialing process had required a political sponsor she had never had and had never known how to obtain. She sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes clear and attentive, and Lyra had to look away from her for a moment when she first saw her. Because the specific injustice of 63 years of practice arriving at its first formal recognition in the front row of a morning class was something she needed a moment to carry without letting it carry her away. 12 of the 40 students were Omegas. 3 of them had previous exile orders on their records, now formally expunged under the Accord's retroactive provision, a provision that had required significant legal argument to include, and that Lyra had fought for with the specific and focused tenacity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Because an accord that protected future healers without addressing the harm done to existing ones was an incomplete accounting. She had written the expungement provision herself. She began the first class the way she had decided to begin it from the earliest days of the Academy's planning, not with a lecture on anatomy or pharmacology or the formal taxonomy of illness, all of which would come in due time and would be taught with rigor and care, but with a question. She stood at the front of the hall in the morning light, and she looked at 40 faces and she asked, "What do you already know?" She listened to the answers for 2 hours. What the students already knew was vast and specific and rooted in the particular knowledge of people who had been learning from necessity rather than from curriculum, knowledge of local plants and their properties, knowledge of the specific ways certain illnesses moved through certain communities, knowledge of how to be present with someone who is frightened and in pain in a way that does not minimize the fear or the pain, but also does not abandon the person to it. It was not the knowledge of the official medical system. It was something older and in many ways more intimate. And it was exactly the kind of knowledge the official medical system had been systematically discarding for generations and would, under the Academy's framework, be systematically incorporating from this point forward. In the corner of the hall, in a basket lined with Marate's old traveling blanket, which he had donated to the Academy with the slightly gruff practicality of someone performing sentiment without wanting to be caught doing so, Lyra's daughter was sleeping. She was not yet 1 year old. Her name was Sarah. Lyra had chosen the name alone, before telling Caelan, and he had received it with an expression that told her he understood exactly who it was for and considered it exactly right. He had not offered an alternative. He had simply said the name once, quietly, in the way of someone testing how it sounded in the world, and nodded. Sable was in the front row of the 40 students, the youngest by a significant margin at 12 years old. Her notebook already half filled with observations from the first 2 hours of class despite the fact that class had not technically begun. She had arrived the previous evening on the early courier from her home village, had organized the Academy's supply stores before breakfast with an efficiency that had impressed even Dresh, and had taken her seat in the front row with the settled self-possession of someone who has been preparing for exactly this for approximately 1 year and considers the preparation to have been entirely adequate. Marate was not a student. He was the Academy's groundskeeper, a role he had accepted with the particular dignity of a man who knows his capabilities precisely and has no interest in overstating them. He kept the building's practical systems functioning, managed the herb garden in the courtyard with an expertise developed over 7 decades of southern living, and appeared at the door of whatever room Lyra was working in with food at regular intervals throughout the day. A pattern he had apparently decided was simply part of his responsibilities, and that she had accepted with the grace of someone who has learned to receive care without treating it as a complication. Adjacent to the Academy, the sanctuary occupied the building that had been the cooperative hall. Its doors had no official seal. Its practice rooms were governed by the Equal Healer Council's rules alone. No territorial authority. No council warrant, no political sponsor required for entry. In its first 3 months of operation, 11 healers had come to it from 6 different territories, Practitioners of gifts that ranged from the unusual to the genuinely inexplicable by the kingdom's existing medical vocabulary. And every one of them had been received with the same response. Tell us what you can do, and we will build the framework around the reality of it, rather than asking you to fit your reality into our existing framework. Dresh administered the sanctuary with the same quiet, methodical intelligence that had made her invaluable during the Accord's drafting. She and Lyra met twice a week to review cases, share observations, and argue productively about the places where their approaches diverged, which were fewer than either of them had expected and more generative when they occurred than either of them had anticipated. They had become, over the course of the winter and spring, something that Lyra had not had since her exile and had not realized until recently how much she had missed: a colleague, a peer, someone who understood the work from the inside and brought their own full intelligence to it, without needing to make themselves smaller to fit beside her. The Equal Healer Council met for the first time in the spring. Caelan attended as one vote among 12. He arrived on time, sat in his assigned seat with no visible indication that the assigned seat was any different from any other seat. Listened to the proceedings with the complete attention that was simply how he listened to things now, and voted on 3 provisions. He agreed with the majority on 2 and disagreed on 1, which he noted in the record with a brief and precise statement of his reasoning. Afterward, walking back from the council building to the academy, where Lyra was finishing a late class, he had seemed lighter somehow, as though the experience of being one voice among 12, accountable to the same process as everyone else and no more determinative of its outcome, had given him something he had not been able to find in the singular authority he had been carrying alone since adolescence. She had noticed this and had said so, directly, because she had decided that directness was the thing she would not give up in whatever they were building together. That whatever ease or warmth or happiness came between them would be built on the foundation of honest speech, rather than the easier and more fragile foundation of managed surfaces. He had considered what she said for a moment and then agreed with it. He had said, "It is easier to be good in a system that requires accountability from everyone than to be good in a system that requires it from no one." She had said, "Yes, that is the entire argument." He had said, "I know. You won." She had looked at him and felt, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, the specific and sustaining warmth of being known by someone who has chosen to know you fully rather than conveniently. Now, at the end of the academy's first day, the afternoon light was going long and golden through the south-facing windows, lying across the worn stone floor in warm oblongs, and the 40 students were filing out with the particular energized tiredness of people who have spent a day doing something that matters to them. Sable was the last to leave, stopping at the door to inform Lyra that she had identified 2 areas where the morning's discussion could have been more efficiently organized, and that she would prepare a written summary of her observations for review. Lyra told her to go eat something and come back in the morning. Sable appeared to consider this a reasonable compromise and left. In the corner, Sarah stirred in her basket. Lyra crossed the room and picked her up, feeling the specific warm weight of her settle against her shoulder with the uncomplicated rightness of something that has found its correct position. Sarah made a small sound of opinion about the waking process and then fell quiet, looking around the room with the serious and comprehensive attention of a baby who is genuinely interested in the world. Footsteps in the doorway. She did not need to look. She felt him through the bond, steady and warm and present, the way a fire is present in a room. And she had stopped resisting what that steadiness did to something in her chest, had stopped treating it as a vulnerability and started treating it as what it actually was, which was simply true. He came and stood beside her. He looked at Sarah with the expression he always brought to their daughter, which was the expression of a man who has been surprised by love and has decided not to be dignified about it. He lifted a hand, and Sarah, who had strong opinions about most things, regarded the hand with her serious and comprehensive attention, and then reached for his finger with both of hers and held it. He looked up at Lyra. She was already looking at him. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was moving across the landscape that had been a quarantine zone 1 year ago, and was now a place where 40 healers were walking home through the spring evening with notebooks full of the first day's knowledge, where a sanctuary's doors stood open for anyone who needed them, where a council of 12 equal voices was building something the kingdom had not had before, a system that asked not who do you know and what is your rank, but what can you do and who does it help. She leaned into his shoulder. Not because she needed the support. She was not a woman who had ever needed the support, who had crossed 10 quarantine villages alone and knelt in plague cities, and built a legal accord from nothing, and opened an academy in a building she had repaired from the framework up. She did not need him. She chose him. And in the choosing, freely made, fully aware of everything it had cost, and everything it had taken to arrive at this particular ordinary evening with its particular ordinary warmth, she felt what she had been building toward through all of it. Not a destination, not a resolution, something quieter and more durable than either of those. A life that was exactly the right size for everything she intended to put in it. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.